Welcome to the Extraordinary Podcast, where we identify God's uncommon work in common life. Recognizing God's work requires intentionality, but articulating it motivates and inspires. Don't forget to subscribe to never miss an episode. In today's episode, I have a conversation with Dixie Moberg, where we really explore her life's journey and how God connected the dots and prepared her for what's to come. So let's get into the conversation with Dixie. Dixie, thank you for being a guest on our podcast today. We appreciate you taking the time to share with us about your journey a little bit. So can you, as we start, share kind of about life growing up for you? What was that like? Any details you'd like to share?
Sure. I'm the oldest of four. I lived in southern Illinois in a tiny little town, and when I say tiny, it's like 70, so little. Didn't grow up going to church when I was young. My parents weren't Christians. I did get taken to church because that was a nice way to get us out of the house on Sunday mornings, and we had some neighbors that were super great, and they would haul me and my brothers and sisters to church. And that changed when my dad got saved, which was, I think, when I was about 8. So he had a lot of health concerns. He was a truck driver. Mom was a stay-at-home mom. And so he ended up kind of getting dramatically saved out of his lifestyle at that time, and decided that we were all going to church. And we went to a little Methodist church, and it was like a family group baptism. Everyone from the baby to him were baptized, and we were church people from then on. So that stayed pretty status quo until I was about 14, and then he ended up dying from cancer. He had like a lot of stuff, so diabetes, cancer, heart disease, but it was cancer that took him when I was 14. And at that point, Mom was just like, stay-at-home mom up to then, and now has 4 kids, the oldest of which is 14. So she went back to work and went back to school actually, and became a nurse. And we didn't see her much my high school years, so she was always either working or going to school. But life went on. We went on. So that's kind of the intro story.
Well, that's a fascinating story, and that's that your dad got saved and how that changed the dynamic of your family. When did you become serious about Jesus in your life?
Well, and like I said, we were church people from the time I was about 7. So anytime the doors were open, we were there, and Bible schools and all that. But I even as a young person who knew all of the right answers in VBS and Sunday school, I still really didn't know Jesus. So that didn't happen until I think I was in 8th grade, and there was a revival that was going on, and so we went. And like I said, little town, so little church. There's like 20 people in this revival. But I felt like the pastor was just preaching like right at me. One of those where you're sitting in the seat and you're like, if they don't call for an altar call, I'm going to have to ask for an altar call. So it was that led. So that's when, I think my walk with Christ really began. And honestly, really, there's been times I've not been as obedient and as close as I should, but it's just kind of been a progression since. So I haven't really had any huge moments of straying or anything. Went to college and actually lived with a family that was super churchy. I was a nanny for them, so that was kind of a protective factor for me during college. So but it all began probably at about 13 years old.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. Now, is college where you met Paul?
I met Paul in grad school.
Okay. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure. After college, I went to grad school at Louisiana State in Baton Rouge, and in chemistry. And he was there also in chemistry. He had come from the U of I, and had his master's, was getting ready to start his doctoral stuff. And so I met him in class, and immediately thought how cute he was. And he asked me out, and I, up to that point had not really dated anyone who wasn't a Christian. And at that point I knew he was not. But I was like, it's a date, who cares? So we went out on a date, and I realized that I had the potential to really like this guy. So that scared me to death. So I told him after our date, he was like, that was a lot of fun. I was like, it super was. We can't see each other again. He was like, why? And I was like, I'm sorry. I said, I really need to date with the intention of marriage at some point, and I can't be married to someone who, doesn't love Jesus. And I said, so I just don't see it going. I was like, I think you're great, and that's the problem. I think you're great. So he was like, oh, okay. And he was super great about it. He was like, okay, I respect that. And I think he did. And then he goes, well, what if I took you to church? And I was like, well, yeah, that would be great. So we started having our Sunday non-dates, that were dates where he would pick me up for church, and then we'd go out to eat afterwards and go to the mall or whatever. And then about, I don't know, maybe 5 months into that, he met with our pastor, and God had been working on his life for a long time, and he came to Christ. And so I'm like, woo, we can date. And he was like, oh no, I should work on my relationship with Jesus. And I'm like, oh, all right, if you really think so. And that lasted like 2 weeks, and then we got engaged. So we never actually dated. We just were engaged for 4 months and then got married.
And how long have you been married?
That wasn't on your question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I think it's like 26 years.
Yeah. So it's and you have 3 kids,
Yes.
and so it's and 2 of your kids are married now. One just recently, so that's exciting.
That's exciting.
So that's a fun story
Yeah.
to hear about you and Paul. Now, you said you were doing your graduate work in chemistry.
Yeah.
What was your undergrad in?
Also chemistry.
Okay, and what was your plan or dreams with your graduate work?
Yeah, I thought that it would be really cool to get my doctorate and then teach at a small liberal arts college and teach chemistry, like really light on the research, heavy on just the teaching and interacting with the college kids. So that was my plan.
And did you what changed?
Well, got married, and my focus on school became less important to me. Then we had Gabby. So at that point I was like, oh, I'm a mom, and we really need, things like health insurance and money. And so I took a job as a chemist and left grad school and worked as a chemist. Yeah.
And now eventually you got involved in the Christian school here in Mount Pleasant. And can you tell about that journey a little bit?
Yeah, so I taught, well, let me back that up. I worked as a chemist until we were expecting Cade. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, Paul and I talked about it, and it didn't really make a lot of sense, but we felt like that the Lord was telling us to raise kids and not money. And so I quit my job and stayed at home with them for about 10 years. Mm-hmm. And then I was homeschooling at the time because Gabby had tried public school, wasn't a huge fan. So turns out by 5th grade, she was also not a huge fan of homeschool. So we were looking into other options. But about then, Cade was diagnosed with diabetes. So he was 7, and it was in spring, and he was diagnosed with diabetes. And we knew that come fall, we were looking for some different education options for the kids. But now we had Cade, who had to take shots 4 times a day and was 7, not really at an age where he could do that. So I called some public schools and was like, so, hey, what do you do? Do you have a nurse, And they didn't. And that doesn't surprise me now, but it did then. And I was like, so what would be the plan? And they're like, well, we have a janitor who's diabetic, and they could probably help. And so I was just like, wow, I don't really feel super comfy. I'm nothing against the janitor. They're probably fabulous at it, but they're not trained in it. And Cade's 7 and squirrely, and it just didn't feel right. So Paul and I were talking, and he was like, well, Mount Pleasant has a Christian school. Maybe you could, they'd be flexible enough that you could run in if you got a job in Mount Pleasant on your lunch break, give them a shot. And I was like, oh, that's a great plan. So I called them, and then I was on the phone. I was like, oh, I wonder if they have a job there. Like I could go be, the lunch lady or the janitor or something. So I called them and said I had 3 kids, and I was looking at school for next fall, and wondered if they had a position. And the secretary was like, well, what's your background? And I was like, oh, well, I have a degree in chemistry, but I was thinking I could do anything. She goes, wait, you have a degree in chemistry? And I was like, yeah, but it's not education, it's just chemistry. And she's like, well, we need a science teacher. And here you don't have to have an education degree, just a degree in your subject. And I'm like, oh, well, okay. So I interviewed, and they offered me that position. And so I was super nervous about it because I'd never taught. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Christian school environment, but one teacher does a ton of stuff. So I was teaching everything from 6th grade through 12th grade science and math. There was Bible thrown in there, some literature, and I'm like, oh, golly. But yeah, so I was like, this seems to meet a need for us. And it met a need for them. And I found God works that way. When we have needs that need to be met, he usually uses them to meet someone else's too. So.
I think that's an incredible story about how God puts the pieces together. And your family had a need, the Christian school had a need, and so praise the Lord for that. And I'm sure, and in everybody's life there are times where you say, I wish I could have done this or that or whatnot, but you can look back and then you can see how God prepared you for what was ahead. So that's cool. How long were you at the Christian school?
11 years. So when I was originally thinking of going back to work, I thought, well, I'll go be a chemist because that's my degree. But like I said, MPCS had a need, and we had a need, and it worked out so nice. So there 11 years. It was an amazing time. I love the kids. They would stop by the house. They were friends with my kids, and so it was just a lot of fun. And then also you're just in such a little bubble. Like everybody there is Christians, right? So there's prayer time before school. There's devotions. There's just so much God going on that it was just such a really encouraging place to work. I grew a lot in those 11 years.
Now, close to the end of your time there, you went back to school.
Yeah. And
so can you explain what led you to do that and what you pursued?
So like I said, by the time I'd been there 9 years or so, 10, maybe 8, I really knew pretty much what I was doing. I'd had all my tests written, all my notes were written. I could have really just done that job until I was, dead. It was just really easy, and I really enjoyed it. And that was what I thought my life would be. And I was fulfilled by that. But I'd always thought about, back when I was younger, being a nurse. I always admired the profession. My mom had gone back to work and was a nurse. She was a hospice nurse, and I really admired the work she did. And I really am someone who enjoys meeting the needs of people who can't meet their own. So just the idea behind what a nurse was super appealed to me, but it isn't something that I ever thought was in my future. I wasn't super keen on the idea of, blood. And I wasn't super keen on the idea of stressful situations where people might die. And I certainly was not keen on the idea of going back to school because I'm, at this point, 44, and I'm a teacher. I don't need to go back to school was my thought process. So it felt like something that wasn't supposed to be. And I was fine with that. It was like, that's okay. But there was a night I was at a function at the school helping, and Aletha was helping too. And her father at that point was having some health challenges. And she got a call that said that he had fallen. And so Opal, her mama, is a tiny little thing and was not able to help him up. So I and her and then a friend of ours who's like an EMT type guy went out to help with that. And I didn't really know what I was doing. It was really the EMT guy was just like, boom, and then he was all fixed up. But there's a point I'm just watching this. I was like, oh my goodness, I really would love to know and have a skill set that I'm able to be helpful here. And I'm really not. I'm just kind of like, you got this. Way to go, So, and I was just thinking, gosh, I wish I knew how to do this. This seems important. Not that what I was doing wasn't. It just felt right. And so we're on our way home, and I'm in the back seat, they're in the front seat, and I'm just kind of praying and just, nothing in particular, just telling God. I was like, help Don and Opal tonight. And that was cool the way this guy got him up, and I wish I knew how to do that. That would be so cool, God, if I knew how to do that stuff. And I'm not, God doesn't speak to me very often, or hardly ever, or maybe just once, but it was like a voice in my head, and it was just like, well, now's the time, go do it. And I was just like, I'm mouthy, so even when I pray, I'm a little mouthy. And I was like, oh, you don't just go do it, God. You have to get a degree. I just can't go do it. And it was just like, I don't know. He has a lot of patience with me. Because I imagine he was just like, well, let me break it down. So he's like, so go to school and go do it. And I was like, what? That's ridiculous, right? I'm mid-40s and I have an established career. And if I didn't want this one, I could go back and be a chemist. I was like, that's so not even cool right now, God. So I didn't say anything much about it, but the thought just never left. And then I talked to Paul and to Letha, and it just felt like this was something God was saying to do, so I did.
and so you've been an RN for at least a couple of years now, mm-hmm. And what are some things you really like about it? What are some things that aren't your favorite?
Okay. Well, what I really like about it is being there when people are at a point where they don't really have any other answers or options. That sounds horrible to say, but I really do like the ER because I feel like you're with people when they're at their low, right? And it's kind of an honor, really, because there are Christians that come in and I can tell that, and I can pray with them. And then there are other people that I know or not, but I still ask, and they usually let me pray because you're pretty desperate when you're in the ER. So I like being able to be helpful. I like being able to be there when people need something, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons God sent me there. Not that He needed a nurse there. I just think He knew that it was something that I really would benefit from, and I think He works that way. He's a win-win God, right? And it turned out to be worth it when you think nursing school was crazy hard. I didn't think it would be because I had been through regular school, but doing nursing school while still teaching full time and doing it with kids that are my kids' age, that are like 19 and 20. And like my very first lab partner in CNA school was this 20-year-old guy that was a football player, and he was doing so he's like my lab partner, and I'm like, I'm super sorry, but you're stuck with the old lady. And he was like really cool about it. We're still friends today, but it's just it's different. It's really awkward.
And you said it was hard, but yeah. And I mean you had a full-time job, you had a family, you had school, but there's also they're not called practicums, clinicals, yes, where you have to go and learn kind of hands-on, I guess.
Right.
But so it's very demanding from a time standpoint, even if you're just a full-time student.
Right.
But you had many other responsibilities through that. So one of the things I find interesting about your story is you could have stayed where you were, but you felt God telling you that now was a time to change. Right. And I mean, mid-40s isn't that old.
Isn't that old?
Well, but from a professional standpoint, it's getting to the point where it's hard to change at that point.
Right.
But regardless of how old or young we are, if God calls us, we're wise to respond.
Right.
And so someone who may be struggling with what they're doing now or struggling to have the courage to make the change, do you have any words of wisdom for them?
Yeah. Well, first off is I don't think God leads if we're not willing to listen, right? I think we have to be trying. We have to be in the Word, and we have to be praying and seeking out what it is He wants us to do. And I'm not super great at that. There's like days when I open my Bible app and it's like, ooh, streak of 1, so it keeps track of your days. But I do think that I've never had a time where I didn't put in the time and He where I put in the time and he didn't, right? I mean, his effort has always been met and magnified. So I think that's the first thing. And I think it's also helpful to have some godly friends that know you really well, that you feel you can be transparent with, because some of the things that I feel like some of the things they don't make sense, right? And so it's really helpful to say, hey, this is what I thought, this is what I prayed, this is what I heard, what do you think? Because if you have someone who can be honest with you and go like, yeah, I think that's a God thing, or I don't know, that sounds like a Dixie thing. How much did you really pray about that? So having those type of people are really important. But the biggest thing is to not be afraid to look stupid, because sometimes things are asked of you that really don't make sense. There's a lot. I mean, if you look at my career path, it's super random, right? And there's a lot of it that on the surface doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to leave my chemistry job. It was a pretty good job. It didn't make sense to leave it. And it didn't make sense to go teach when I could have gone back to a career that was, I don't know, more lucrative for sure. But and it really didn't feel like it made sense to go back to school in my mid-40s and do nursing. But it doesn't have to, right? I think that a lot of God's plans look awkward on the surface at best and require you to be able to embrace awkward, because there's been a lot of awkward times in nursing school, and then just learning. There was one time I was just starting in the ER, and the doctor said something. I asked him a question, and he just looked at me. He goes, "You've been a nurse for years. I trust your judgment." And I just laughed. I was like, "Well, okay, thanks, but I've been a nurse for like 2 months, so maybe don't trust my judgment." So there's a perception that you're an old nurse that knows all, and you don't. So there's a little awkward there when you go, I've only been a nurse 2 years, and they're like, "What? So what have you done with your life?" So it's just kind of be open to awkward, because God works through awkward so much. I'm not sure. At least maybe that's just my experience, but awkward seems to happen a lot.
I think that was just very beautifully said. Thank you for your transparency with that. And as you may say it's awkward, but I see a lot of dots connected through your life. How God was putting all that together. I mean, something as your mom going back to school when you were 14 or high school or something like that showed you it was possible.
Right. She was 40 when she went, so.
And so that's not that you wished that your dad passed away and put that hardship on your family, but God prepared you, let you know it's possible, and he made a way for you to be where you are today. But you still had to have the courage to be obedient. But I will say your statement of your effort has been met and magnified. Man, what a powerful statement! Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Aletha has a saying that I use all the time that says, "If we do the natural, God will do the super," and I feel like that's just the case. Like on the surface, a lot of things didn't look like it should work, but I found that if I put in what I could, then He made up the difference. So it worked out great.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm not going to cloud it with anything I have to say because you've just been so awesome. Is there anything you would like to add or anything else on your heart today?
I don't think so.
Thank you for sharing. I appreciate your transparency and just how you articulate how God has been with you throughout your whole life. So thank you for sharing and being a guest on our podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this podcast. Be on the lookout for how God does uncommon work in common life. And please subscribe to never miss an episode.